Welcome to Compelling Topics, the only channel dedicated to the perspective of leading researchers from the Italian independent scene. Let's turn your minds on. In this video, we explore a controversial and little-known historical hypothesis presented by researcher Simonetta Torresi. Through old maps, historical documents, and archaeological findings, she questions the traditional identification of Cologne as the ancient Roman Colonia Agrippinensium. Her investigation leads to an unexpected possibility that the true location of this important Roman colony may have been somewhere very different from what modern historians believe. Professor Torresi examines the city of Cologne in present-day Germany. Cologne exists and is an enormous metropolis of approximately 1,800,000 inhabitants, the fourth largest city in all of Germany. She shows images of present-day Cologne, including its famous cathedral. However, the professor specifies that she designates monuments or cities as true or false based on whether they are original, meaning they have not been reconstructed later. To understand this question properly, precision is necessary. The professor consults the official Treccani encyclopedia to verify what it says about ancient Cologne. According to this source, the first nucleus of the city was a small fortified settlement that the Ubi established at this point after Agrippa transported them from the right to the left bank of the Rhine River in 38 BC. Near this Oppidum Ubiorum, whose original name is uncertain, the Era Ubiorum was established a few years later, perhaps by Drusus between 12 and 9 BC. This was intended to be the gathering center for Germanic peoples subject to Rome, just as Lyon was for the Gauls. The location commanded the point where the easiest and most frequented communication route between Germania and Gaul crossed the Rhine. As early as the time of Augustus and Tiberius, 2 legions were stationed there, later transferred elsewhere. In 50 AD, to satisfy Agrippina II, who was born there, Emperor Claudius established a colony of veterans in the city. From then on, the city was called either Colonia Claudia Era Agrippinensium or Colonia Agrippinensium. Later, from the 5th century AD onward, it was simply called Cologne. The city was enrolled in the Claudian tribe and enjoyed the privilege of ius Italicum. The professor emphasizes there would be much to say historically. The first oppidum was built by Agrippa, who constructed half of Rome. His name appears on the Pantheon. Agrippa was a great builder and also a friend of Augustus, serving as his captain in the Battle of Perugia against Livia's first husband. With high probability, Agrippa came from Visso in the province of Macerata, since Visso was later called Vipsanum. The professor notes that the foundation was probably made by Agrippa, but perhaps a few years later by Drusus, between 12 and 9 BC. Drusus was also descended from a family originating in the Marche region, the Claudii of Pesaro in the province of Macerata. Subsequently, Emperor Claudius arrived, and even Agrippa's daughter Agrippina appears to have been born in this Cologne, at least according to Tacitus. The professor highlights several oddities. The city was called both Colonia Claudia Era Agrippinensium and Colonia Agrippinensium. She finds it strange that a city would have two different names in official documents. While a city might colloquially be called by different names, having two official designations is truly unusual. Additionally, from the 5th century AD, it was called simply Cologne. Another peculiarity is that this Cologne enjoyed the privilege of ius Italicum, Italian law, in Germania. Continuing with the Tracani, the professor notes that Cologne housed the legate commanding the army of Germania Inferior. Vitellius was proclaimed emperor there, Trajan received news of his accession to the throne there, and Postumus besieged and captured it in 59 AD. Cologne was the seat of the consularis governor of Germania Secunda and various military corps. The professor points out an important subtlety. The text states that the legate commanding the army of Germania Inferior had his headquarters in Cologne, but then says that after Diocletian divided the province, it became the seat of the governor of Germania Secunda, meaning Germania Superior. A contradiction arises. If Diocletian divided the province, how could Germania Inferior already exist? Even more incredibly, was Cologne the headquarters of the commander of the army of Germania Inferior or Superior? The source is unclear and presents inconsistencies requiring clarification. The professor continues consulting official encyclopedias. According to these sources, around the middle of the 3rd century the city was destroyed by the Alemanni, but subsequently rebuilt by Emperor Julian. The sources also speak of guilds of artisans and merchants of every kind, along with numerous inscriptions dedicated to individuals engaged in the most diverse arts and professions. All this supposedly testified to intense industrial and commercial activity. However, the professor observes that despite these descriptions of an economically vibrant and developed city, the archaeological remains actually found are relatively scarce. The sources mention only some elements of city walls, perhaps dating partly to the 1st century AD and partly to restorations carried out under Emperor Gallienus at the end of the 3rd century. Numerous epigraphic testimonies are also cited documenting city life, votive inscriptions, military and sepulchral inscriptions, and traces of temples. Some of these traces were found near the cathedral, where it is believed a sacred area once existed. The professor recalls an earlier observation. Beneath the cathedral something from Roman times was indeed found, but no medieval structures. The sources also mention a bridge built or rebuilt in masonry by Emperor Constantine, which would have connected Cologne to the right bank of the Rhine. At that point, there was also a fortified camp controlling access to the bridge. Finally, about 3 kilometers downstream, near present-day Altenburg, the base of the Rhine fleet, the Classis Germanica, was supposedly located. The professor observes, however, that despite numerous indications of artisan activities, corporations, and economic vitality, material testimonies are very limited. There is talk of inscriptions, traces, and isolated elements, but no significant remains emerge that would clearly identify the great city described by the sources. Even regarding the walls, information appears uncertain. Remains are mentioned that perhaps belong to the 1st century or to 3rd century restorations, without clear chronological definition. The professor therefore wonders where exactly this great city of Cologne described by the sources was, given that the identified remains seem extremely limited. Another question concerns the Rhine fleet base, the Classis Germanica. Sources indicate it was south of the city, near Altenburg. The professor emphasizes, however, that sources explicitly speak of a fleet, not 1 or 2 isolated vessels. The Latin term classis indicates an entire military fleet. This raises a question: how would the Romans have brought a fleet to the Rhine in that area? If it truly involved numerous military ships, they would have had to be transported or built on site. If they were built there, however, one would expect to find remains of shipyards or infrastructure related to ship construction. According to the professor, however, no clear traces of these structures emerge. Sources only generically indicate the area near Altenburg, without precise localization or evident remains. Returning to the bridge attributed to Constantine, sources speak of a bridge built or rebuilt in masonry, thus a solid structure that should have left material traces. Moreover, the bridge was defended by a fortified camp controlling access to the structure. Here too the professor wonders where the remains of these works are. If they were masonry constructions in a fortified area, one would expect to find at least some recognizable material elements. Moving to the medieval period, the professor observes that at a certain point the city begins to be called simply Cologne. However, sources do not clearly explain why the name was abbreviated or how this transformation occurred. The professor also connects the city to Frankish history. She recalls that the Franks were divided into two major groups, the Salian Franks, from whom the Merovingian dynasty derived, and the Ripuarian Franks. According to some historical sources, Constantine installed the king of the Ripuarian Franks at Cologne. If so, the professor observes, there should have been a residence or palace for this sovereign. However, she wonders where this structure was located, since no clear indications emerge about remains of such a building. Summarizing the analyzed elements, the professor observes that the situation appears unclear in several respects. The wall remains are uncertain, and it's unclear precisely which period they belong to. The bridge attributed to Constantine seems to have left no evident traces. The fortified camp that supposedly controlled bridge access is not identifiable, and the location of the residence of the Ripuarian Frankish king, who was supposedly installed at Cologne, is unknown. Returning to the Middle Ages, she recalls that Cologne was a very important city in that era. In particular, it hosted what is described as the largest medieval fair in the region. However, even here precise documentation is lacking about where this great fair took place within the city. No document indicates clearly the exact point where this important market was held. Another observation concerns city coats of arms. If Cologne had been a major medieval city, one would expect to find heraldic emblems dating to very ancient times. According to the professor, however, the city's coats of arms that have been found seem to date only from the 16th century, around 1500. No earlier examples emerge. The professor concludes that regarding Roman testimonies, relatively little is found. Regarding the Middle Ages, documentation is not much richer. She notes that a large, populous city should have left many more material traces. In a city of great size, for example, one would expect mills for flour production or remains of workshops and factories, especially if such an important commercial fair existed. However, no clear evidence of these structures emerges. At this point, the professor introduces a document she considers particularly interesting. It is a page from a book titled Praxis Vicarii Capitularis, an official legal text. The work contains an engraving made in 1660 by Giuseppe Mattei, an engraver from Macerata. In the engraving, the city of Macerata appears in the foreground, which at that time exercised a form of administrative authority over several other cities. Around it, various localities are depicted according to geographical logic. Among these appears Perugia, indicated with the Latin name Perugia, and on the coast appears Ancona, with the sea clearly represented. Further north also appears Rimini, indicated with the Latin name Ariminum. Above this area, toward the interior, however, a surprising name appears, Colonia Agrippina. The professor emphasizes that the engraving is dated 1660 and signed by Giuseppe Mattei. Since the book was an official text used in legal contexts, she considers it improbable that this was a simple error. In her view, the fact that the name Colonia Agrippina appears in that position suggests that at the time a place with that name was known. She also observes that in the southern part of the engraving, cities are indicated with Latin names, while in other parts Italian names are used. The fact that above Rimini appears the inscription Colonia Agrippina would therefore suggest that in 1660 this designation was known and recognized. This raises a question. Where exactly was this city indicated as Colonia Agrippina located? According to the position shown in the engraving, it would seem to be situated in northern Italy, north of Rimini, and toward the interior. The professor decides to compare this information with other documents. Some sources indicate that Colonia Agrippina was located north of Bonn, beyond the Rhine. Bonn, in turn, would have been founded by the Gallic boy, the same population that also founded Bologna. Taking as reference a city located north of Bologna and beyond the Rhine, the professor observes that in that area, the only important city that could correspond to this description would be Ferrara. For this reason, she decides to investigate Ferrara's history to verify whether a city or significant settlement existed there in Roman times. According to some historians founding their claims on writings of Polybius, Ferrara was built by the Pelasgians and called Massalia. Archaeological finds demonstrate anthropization of the territory from the Bronze Age, and during the Roman period it is certain that a city existed there. So the Roman city existed. Sources also say where. The nucleus was concentrated in today's districts of San Nicolo, San Giorgio, and in the centers of Voghera and Vogenza. Of this city, remarkably, the name is not known. Indeed, it is known for certain that the current toponym, Ferrara, was introduced in the early medieval period. Although Ferrara was probably originally Massalia, its foundational name. The first known historical document in which the city is thus named dates to 753 from Astolfo, king of the Lombards, who with this act declares his dominion over the city. The Lombards named it thus. Subsequently, in 774, with the loss of power of the Lombard king Desiderius by the Franks, the Ducatus Ferrarii came under management of the Archbishop of Ravenna. But already by 988 the city had autonomous governance. The professor recalls that when she spoke of the Abbey of Farriers it was around 900, so it's correct, it was the Ducatus Ferrariensis. Given that historians don't know what this city was called, and that Giuseppe Mattei wrote Colonia Agrippina there in the official book of the period, considering that all other cities were precise, Rimini was truly called a Riminum, and they are placed at the correct geographical points. Therefore, Colonia Agrippina was there. And then the Classis Germanica also makes sense, because south of Ferrara is the place called Class, precisely Class, and Augustus had it built to house a fleet. Historians say to house a fleet watching the Adriatic, but there was the enormous port of Ancona watching the Adriatic. Was it necessary to build the port at Class a few kilometers further up? Therefore, the Classis Germanica was at Class, because Colonia Agrippina was Ferrara. Simple. But at this point one must question the fact that this famous Colonia Agrippina, which everyone calls Colonia Agrippina, was actually called in Roman times Colonia Claudia Era Agrippinensis or Colonia Agrippinensium, and was sometimes called by one name, sometimes by another. Moreover, there was another enormous fact. Sources sometimes say there was the general of Germania Superior, sometimes they say there was the one of Germania Inferior. Among other things, Germania Superior was called Germania Secunda, because Secunda means there was already a first. And if it's second, then later it gets called Superior and Inferior. Two names. There was one over Germania Superior, one over Germania Inferior. But could it be that there were two cities with more or less the same name? After all, why not? It is known there were two Senna, one in Tuscany called Senna Etruria, the other in the Marche which today is called Senna Gallica, but originally they were both Senna. Later the Romans gave them the distinguishing designation. One might say, fine, Ferrara was Germania Inferior, and then when they went up there to Cologne. No, actually no, because up there the city doesn't exist, there are only these few inscriptions, little stuff. So where was it? And Germania Inferior had to be somewhere else. Because, for example, the bridge that Constantine built or rebuilt in masonry, which had this particular fortified space where a fortified camp guarded its access, well, that doesn't exist in Ferrara, so one must look a bit to see where it could be. The professor shows an image. A bridge that Constantine built or rebuilt in masonry connected Cologne with the right bank, where a fortified camp guarded its access. Here is the bridge, and in front of the bridge, there was a fortified camp guarding its access. Bridges like this are unique. There are no other bridges made in this manner. There's the river. The professor shows a map of San Severino. At the bottom left is that bridge shown earlier enlarged. San Severino Marche. How can this be? But that bridge is there. It's not in any other city. One must try to find it elsewhere. So one must see if it's possible that this San Severino Marche could be Colonia Agrippinensium, because Ferrara was Colonia Claudia era Agrippinensis. So this was Colonia Agrippinensium in Roman times. Constantine, besides building this bridge, installed the king of the Ripuarian Franks at Cologne. If you go to this map, in the upper part that is surrounded by black dashes and white dots, the more restricted area, that more restricted piece, there was called Castrum Regalis, royal castle. A king was there. Moreover, this very particular bridge, that fortification is along a road, what today they call a bypass of the Flaminian Way, which the professor says is probably the original Flaminian Way. That camp there was on the road. Why did Constantine have this bridge built? To try to prevent people from arriving from the Rhine. The Ripuarian Franks. It was a defense for the king of the Ripuarian Franks who was up there. Here it makes sense. But then where was the colony, given that everything else seen below was built later? Fortunately, many parchments have been preserved in San Severino. But one must then see where the ancient city was, because where Constantine had placed it was on a height outside the city walls, but quite close to the city. And what city was there? There was what is known as Septempeda. The professor shows the coat of arms of the municipality of San Severino, both current and ancient, which is very similar. The coat of arms is identical to the current Cologne Cathedral with two towers in front. They say they made it that way because they found ancient things that were like that. That wasn't just the coat of arms, it was where the municipality proper was located. The professor examines the church of Santa Maria della Pieve, also in San Severino, in the Septempeda area. The image shows a very interesting part. What is now visible is barely one nave of the ancient church. You can see the columns, and then the brick with which the arches were closed. There was an enormous church there that had a different orientation. If you go there, you can perfectly see the enormous church. On the plaque outside, it says 6th-11th century. The plaque reads, Church of Santa Maria della Pieve, formerly Severino Septempeda, 6th-11th century. The professor states this was the true cathedral of Cologne. Someone might object that it can't be because Cologne in the Middle Ages, Cologne without the addition. It can't be because Septempeda, they say, was destroyed by Totila, and therefore the inhabitants took refuge in the castle seen earlier. But it's very strange, because even in the Middle Ages tithes were still paid for two churches at Septempeda. And if two churches stood among ruins. Not only that, no fewer than two popes issued papal bulls for Septempeda's churches. If there was nothing left, the popes even went to the trouble of issuing papal bulls. The professor cites what the Jesuit Giovanni Battista Cancellati says in 1643. There are extremely superb marble tombs, stones of finest carving, and most beautiful bronze statues testifying to the city's magnificence and greatness. A bronze horse was found in the ancient cathedral. Copper, silver, and gold coins emerged profusely from the subsoil for centuries, often contained in vases by the hundreds. In 1643, domus and baths and mighty walls with monumental gates of this city could still be seen. Nothing is known of Septempeda. This city has disappeared from history, almost sucked into a black hole. So of Cologne, everything that doesn't exist is said. Here nothing of what exists is known. Yet it was there. In the territories the professor discusses, if you go with a metal detector you become rich. For centuries they took stuff there, and even in 1640 all those things could still be seen. So Totila didn't destroy it. This city continued to exist, so much so that there is documentation that in the height of the Middle Ages, when the municipality of San Severino was formed, one of the first very strong municipalities, there was a mayor for the city. So if there was a mayor, where was he? Among ruins? Whom did he have to manage? The professor turns to Cologne. Documents say that the city of Cologne was composed of the old city and the new city. And here there was the old city and the new city. The old city is the ancient pre-Roman and Roman city Septempeda. The new city is what was formed, the medieval city. Then the professor read that in Cologne Saint Victorinus died. But in San Severino there is the cult of Saint Victorinus who died there. That makes two saints. But that's not all. There was a great fair in San Severino. And in San Severino there is complete documentation of where the fair was located, exactly between the old city and the new city. This space was so large that today there are the train station, public gardens, the San Severino Technical Institute, now gone because it was damaged by earthquakes, but it was a large institute, a couple of gymnasiums, and a road. That fair existed because it's documented. It's even known where it was. Moreover, there is a disproportionate quantity of mills that were sold and purchased by the municipality. There is also the artisan or industrial area, call it what you will, of the city. There are even factories. So here there is Saint Severinus, the bridge, Castel Real where the king of the Ripuarian Franks was, factories, the fair location, papal bulls. In San Severino there are all the parchments, everything. Up there is nothing. But was Cologne up there? Strange. They stole our history, but the serious thing is that Italians don't realize it. These are facts. Because points of view are hypotheses, and it's right that there should be multiple points of view, but as the Romans said, against facts there are no arguments. So here we have the German-style church, which is the famous Westwork. This is typical medieval German architecture. So there's the German church, the city coat of arms identical to the cathedral. There's the cathedral, the old cathedral which certainly has no fewer than 5 churches underneath. There's the old city and the new city, because Septempeda and San Severino. There's the place where the great fair was. Here it makes sense because there was the Flaminian Way and the Salarian Way. So 2 very important roads joined. There was the bridge that Constantine built. There's Castel Real where the king of the Ripuarian Franks was. There's the old cathedral. The ancient cathedral of Septempeda where all those marvels were. Found indicating there was an amazing city, because even in 1600 all that stuff was still being found. And therefore this was Cologne, the Cologne of Germania Inferior, Colonia Agrippinensium. Then clearly the professor has all the historical proofs to say so, beyond these which are monumental, which are proofs that can be touched. The professor concludes by stating, attention, this is not a point of view. These are facts. When there are documents, one can do nothing but accept reality. Moreover, a reality that gives to Caesar what is Caesar's, because very often people go outside Italy to search for origins, churches, buildings, and so forth, when it's taken for granted that a city like San Severino Marche cannot have things even more important than those found in a city like Cologne, which apparently was not up there but was here. The debate remains open, and the evidence presented raises fascinating questions about the past. If you enjoy exploring alternative historical perspectives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow the channel for more investigations into hidden history and forgotten mysteries. See you in the next episode of The Very Origin of Europe, here on Compelling Topics.
I went to